Everyone could clearly hear behind the noise that someone was walking around the tent in circles. At this point, everyone was shitting themselves, because all the members of the expedition were inside the tent, and the Alas was many kilometers away from the village. The bravest shouted,
"Who's there?"
but got no answer. Suddenly, someone started pounding on the tent from outside with terrible force. The girls began to shout, and then a loud Yakut male voice ordered the two guys who had pissed on the shaman's grave to come out of the tent and called them by name. He called their names, but the frightened friends pushed them out of the tent despite their protests. The guys stood up, looked around, they could not see a fucking thing, it was dark, the wind was raging, all kinds of trash was flying through the air. They stood around for a few minutes, got cold, and crawled back into the tent. All their friends and girlfriends were lying in their places, dead, their faces distorted with horror. The boys were a little crazy, screaming and running around in circles. Finally, somehow, they came to their senses, got into the car and drove back to the village, where they reported the incident to the village council. The fate of the two men is unknown. All we know is that there was no storm in the area that night, and the investigation was pretty rough on the guys, but eventually they were released. As it turned out, their friends had all supposedly died of heart attacks. This one happened, according to the legend, at the end of the 19th century, when Yakutia was already part of Russia and was, accordingly, divided into all sorts of districts, uyezds, etc. The districts were ruled by rich Yakut princes. Here's one such prince from the Central Olis we're going to talk about. This prince was fucked up even by the standards of those times. He took all the people's goods in his district, built for himself mansions unseen in Yakut villages, sucked all the juice out of the poor, and organized a trial according to his own flawed concepts. However, he regularly collected tribute from the population and sent it to the center, so the authorities were pleased with him and were not going to replace him with another. It's not a democracy. One autumn evening, a wandering poor man, Kumalan, came to the house and asked for dinner and an overnight stay, a common occurrence in those days. As a rule, vagrants paid for this service by doing chores their master would give them. But this vagabond looked so frail and ragged, that the prince, casting a haughty look at him from a distance, ordered to throw him out of the yard, which is not at all Yakutian. Usually princes at least give a place in the stable to such poor people. So, they did. The prince noticed that the tramp was hanging around the porch again, and he got angry and ordered to catch him and bring him to him for punishment. The tramp was dragged in, and the prince asked him why he was disobeying him. The wanderer replied in a pitiful voice,
"I'm hungry, and there's nowhere else to go."
If we give you food and shelter, Ochanin, this ragamuffin, Rebame.
The prince asked mockingly, already contemplating how to make fun of the poor man.
"Well,
He hesitated.
I can tell a little of the Olonko."
Let me explain. A Nolonko is a kind of a verbal Yakut national epic, a long, tens and hundreds of thousands of lines, song epic tale about the struggle between the forces of good and darkness. The Olonko masters, capable of continuously improvising and captivating their listeners all day long, were highly esteemed in pre-revolutionary Yakutia, where there were no books, television or the internet. Now the Olonko is included in the UNESCO list as a masterpiece, and the local authorities are so proud of it that they mention it in every speech.
Really?
The prince didn't believe him.
Really? You, a master of talent.
Well, people seemed to like it.
The tramp answered uncertainly. Of course, the prince did not really believe him, but there was nothing to do in the evening anyway, and he decided to give the man a chance. He wanted to listen to the Olonko, and if the poor man was making up nonsense, then he could be punished for it by a public flogging. He said.
You tell me talent before going to sleep until you fall asleep. Until obediently frequently uralanha.
That was the end of it. The prince showed his lousy side again and gave the guest the farthest and coldest corner of the house, where they just laid a hard skin on the floor, as a place to sleep. Although the dinner for the prince's family was hearty and there was plenty left over, the tramp was still given only a tiny portion of cottage cheese and a piece of stale bread. He did not express his dissatisfaction in any way. Evening came. The fire was burning in the stove, the prince settled down on his big bed with his wife, they both covered themselves with a blanket and began to listen to the Olonko from the tramp. To the prince's surprise, the man was reading the Olonko very well, and the plot was interesting and unbeatable. He listened to it for about half an hour making occasional cries of approval, but then he had to take a piss. After telling the tramp to stop, he left the house and went to the latrine. The sky was cloudy and it was drizzling with cold rain. As the prince began to go to the bathroom in the dark, something suddenly grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him off the ground. He looked up, holy fuck. A huge black vulture clutched his shoulders and carried him somewhere in the sky. The prince began to kick, but then realized that if the bird let him go, he would crash, and froze in a frenzy. They flew for a long time. The cold air had time to almost cover the prince's skin with frost, and then the vulture threw the prince down into some wasteland, where a huge bonfire was burning and naked women were dancing nearby. When the prince rose, one of the women came up to him and began to stick the nipple of her lush breasts into his mouth. He tried to turn away, but he seemed paralyzed and the milk poured into his mouth, only it turned out to be blood, not milk. The prince began to swallow the blood so as not to drown himself. When the woman had finished, she laughed and said to him,
"Now you have tasted human blood and separated from the light, you have become one of us."
The prince looked at himself and was fucked. His body had been transformed, covered with pustules and tubercles, and generally began to look like a dead man. The woman said to him,
"There, now you've found your true self. Not for nothing did I send my faithful messenger to you in the guise of a wandering singer to tear out your soul and send away human conventions and do true evil."
Oh.
The prince timidly inquired,
"We will send you back to the middle world,
i.e. Earth.
and you can do whatever bad things you want there."
With these words the woman snapped her fingers, and some half-human half-beasts appeared and grabbed the prince from all sides. They skinned him. The poor guy was in a lot of fucking pain. Broke his neck and turned his head 180 degrees, cut off his nose and lips and ears and scalped him. Then the vulture carried him, squirming, up somewhere again and dropped him in a deserted clearing. The prince realized that he was in one of the alas near his village. But the light hurt him, and at the sight of people he began to panic, and he could not return to the village and show his face to people. He huddled for months in frozen, abandoned houses and became increasingly embittered at the world. When people came to one of his empty dwellings to spend the night, he would sneak up on them at night, strangle them, and then devour their flesh. But this only made his hunger more excruciating. Finally, one day a shaman came to the clearing and began performing a ritual to exorcise the unclean force. The prince felt as if he were burning alive, and suddenly he saw that his body was indeed enveloped by tongues of flame coming from within. He screamed in horror, realizing that this was the end. Screamed and woke up on his bed. It turned out that he had dozed off while listening to the Olanko. His wife was already asleep, the fire in the stove was almost out, and the wondering Olanko master was looking at him with a half-smile.
"Well, did you like my oolong?
He asked.
Is it enough for you? Or should I go on?"
Waking up from his stupor, the prince immediately ordered to light the stove again, ordered to prepare a big dinner and move his guest to the best bedroom, and began to almost kick his ass. The family looked at the prince with amazement. What had gotten into him? The tramp spent the night like a king, and in the morning, the prince gave him one of his best horses and gave him a considerable sum of money. Warmly bidding him farewell, the tramp rode out of the courtyard and left the village. It was not until later that the prince learned that a great shaman had recently passed through his neighborhood somewhere to the north on his own business. Another archetypical spook from Yakutia is usually associated not with evil forces, but with quite neutral and even benevolent spirits of nature, which sometimes, under special circumstances, a person can behold. However, for an unprepared person, such an encounter can still be quite eerie. A young girl was spending her summer in a Yakut village. Since June, there have been white nights in central Yakutia, and falling asleep in the summer is sometimes a problem, especially when the weather is humid. One night the girl couldn't sleep at all. She had been tossing and turning in her bed for hours, trying every way to fall asleep, reading a book, counting sheep, turning over a pillow, but to no avail. When it was well past midnight, she gave up and decided to go outside to get some air. The house where the girl lived was on the outskirts of the village. Beyond that was only a field, and beyond it, a forest. And so, standing on the porch, she heard the sound of some big choir coming from the field, as if people had gathered and were singing. The girl became interested and looked out of the gate. Indeed, there were people in the field, dancing Asuo Kai, so-called the national Yakut dance, reminiscent of a round dance with a chant. All those gathered were dressed very fine. The chant was clearly audible, but the girl, no matter how hard she listened, could not make out a word. Intrigued, she stepped outside the fence and headed into the field. She did not feel any anxiety or fear, It was a warm white night, it was bright as day, and there was a whole crowd of people celebrating something. What was there to be afraid of? However, after traveling about a third of the field, the girl began to notice something wrong. At the gate, she saw that the Asuhai was being conducted in the center of the field, but as she walked, people somehow moved further away, being closer to the edge of the forest, although it seems that they did not move on purpose. The chant did not grow louder, despite the close proximity. Words were still hard to make out, but choir began to break up into separate voices that sounded in a special way unstructured, as if everyone was singing his own special tune without paying attention to others. However, the determined girl kept walking forward, not thinking much about these oddities. The longer she walked, the farther away from her was the Asuokai. Now the dance was carried out literally on the border of the field and the forest. Although the field was bright, the girl could not distinguish the faces of the dancers, she could only see their brightly colored clothes. In the end, after walking more than half of the field, she suddenly realized that there was no more Wasuai, people had somehow imperceptibly disappeared into the forest, but the sounds of their incoherent chanting still continued to be heard from behind the trees. It was then that the girl was startled to realize that she was standing all alone in the field at night. She turned around and ran back. By the time she reached her house, the chant had stopped, and the field was empty again. In the morning, the girl told her family about her nightly encounter. The story did not make a special impression on her relatives, they only noticed that if she saw the dance of the spirits of nature, it was for good and good luck. They scolded the night traveler for the fact that she could not understand for a long time that she could not see real people. They said, "You would also go into the woods in the middle of the night in search of a deer." This story happened to a friend of mine, whose name is Senya. Last August he and his friends decided to go on a nature trip. They took beer, a barbecue and swimming trunks with them. The place they were going to was near the village of Tulagino. A small village is situated across the river, a little farther away there are abandoned houses and cowsheds, and behind them fields, and these fields are infamous among the locals. In high spirits, friends arrived at one of the fields, they settled down, played music loudly in the car, laughed, made a fire and shashlik. Towards the night, with only the dim light of the moon illuminating the wide field, Senya decided to go away to relieve himself. There, standing in the field, was a Yakut hitching post, and Senya decided to mark it, which, by the way, is considered a grave insult to the local spirits according to Yakut belief. Standing, doing his job, enjoying the silence. Suddenly a strange feeling of uneasiness overtook him, as if someone was watching him. After a minute or so, he heard the sound of a tambourine in the distance. In Yakutia, tambourines were used by ancient shamans during their comlands, shamanic sessions. The sound was quiet at first, but with time it was getting closer and growing louder. My friend was anxious, but at the same time he was torn with curiosity and stood listening. The sound of the tambourine was getting closer, it seemed as if it was being played just over the hill, 50 or so paces away from Senya. Senya was trying to see in the dark. Instinctual fear took over him. It seemed to him that someone was standing right behind him and breathing on the back of his head. He got the fuck out of there, running as fast as he could towards the car. When he returned to his friends, he told them what he had heard. Everyone listened. Indeed, the heavy sounds of a tambourine were spreading throughout the surroundings as if coming from all directions at once. The frightened friends got into the car and drove back. Senya never returned to those fields again. It happened to me 12 years ago, when I was a child. Every month my cousin Boria came to visit me. He was older than me and liked to scare me. He wore masks, robes, even took my mother's fur coat to pretend he was a monster. My heart would go in my heels, and he was still laughing. One day,